This is class number 5 of the new God image. And our assignment tonight is the letter to Pastor Tanner, dated February 12, 1959. The subject of this letter is the nature of religion. Now that's absolutely a central topic for Jungian psychology, for the reason that Jung considers the essential nature of the human psyche to be the fact that it has a religious function. And that requires us to have some understanding of what we mean by the term religion and religious. It's used in a lot of different senses. And Jung goes to some trouble in this letter to present with great clarity exactly what he means by religion and by what he means by the religious function in the human psyche. So that's what we'll be looking at tonight. To start with, he speaks about the etymology of the word religion. And he points to the fact that in antiquity and in church history, it's been given two different etymologies, depending on whether one traces the word religion back to the Latin word religare or to the Latin word religare, the two words I have on the board. If you trace it back to the word religare, then you would be following the etymology that St. Augustine used. And that word breaks down to two stem words, re meaning back and ligare meaning to tie or to bind. So a ligature, for instance, is a tie that derives from the smaller Latin word ligare. So then, by that etymology, the word religion means to tie oneself back to some prior state of existence, to a earlier source of being, so to speak. The other etymology has more ancient roots. It was the etymology used by the classic ancients, and they derived the word from religare, which means to take into careful account. Unfortunately, we don't have a neat single verb to apply, so we have to use that rather cumbersome phrase, to take into careful account. But one way to remember the significance of the word religare is to remember that it signifies the opposite of what our word neglect means. Neglect is a negative term that has as its root the same source as religare. So neglect means to not take into careful account, you see. And in this letter, Jung expresses his preference for that second earlier etymology. He then goes ahead to make some very interesting remarks concerning the historical stages of Western religion. He speaks of 3 different ones, and you'll recognize that these are 3 of the 6 stages that I spoke about in the introduction in the first hour. He speaks of the religion of antiquity, of ancient Judaism, and of Christianity. The religion of, just to give you a tag to attach to each one, antiquity is associated with what we call in modern terms superstitious observances, omens. Ancient Judaism was associated primarily with the image of a legal contract, a covenant. And Christianity was largely associated with the idea of a love relationship and the faith and loyalty that is attached to such a relationship. Now I want to say a few words about each of these 3 stages because they correspond to 3 different aspects of the ego's relation to the self. So there are things that it's helpful to be familiar with. Starting first with antiquity. Here's what Jung says about that on page 483. According to the views current in pagan antiquity, the gods are exalted men and embodiments of ever-present powers whose will and whose moods must be complied with. Their noumena must be carefully studied. They must be propitiated by sacrifices, just as the favor of archaic princes is won by gifts. Here religion means a watchful, wary, thoughtful, careful, prudent, expedient, and calculating attitude towards the powers that be, with not a trace of that legal and emotional contract which can be broken like a marriage, which is a reference to the ancient Judaism and Christianity. I think the major collective religious operation of antiquity that epitomizes the nature of that kind of relation to the self is the ceremony of taking the auspices. In ancient Rome, all the way up into the 5th century, there existed what was called a college of augurs. At first they were a small group, maybe about 6. Later they were enlarged to 9, and eventually to 15 or 16. They had many similarities to our modern Supreme Court. They were appointed for life, and the augurs were attributed great dignity in their society. And they formed a priestly college. And whenever any sizable state enterprise was to be initiated, the College of the Augurs was requested to take a reading of the auspices to determine whether it was auspicious to proceed with the undertaking or not. Going to war, of course, would be the biggest undertaking, but lesser ones than that too. And there was an elaborate procedure set up of quite formal proportions to take the auspices. A certain, at the top of a particular hill was marked out, in a specific area was set up. A little tent was set up there, and the augurs took their place in this square tent with the entrance looking south. And the augurs sat down and asked the gods for a sign. And they sat there and waited and watched the birds. And there were complicated rules as to how to read the movements of the birds, but if birds moving in certain directions at certain times in certain ways meant certain things. And just the appearance of certain kinds of special numinous birds was an auspicious event in itself. But they took the reading of the birds, and then they gave their report to the government, and the report was either the birds allow it, so you may proceed with what you're supposed to do, or the report reads on another day, which means the birds don't allow it. The auspices are bad. That was a very major religious ritual in ancient Rome of a collective nature, and I think it illustrates very well the point Jung is making about the etymology of religare, that it means to take into careful account. You see, we do something like that on a more conscious level when we consult the I Ching before embarking on some uncertain enterprise. I find myself taking the auspices all the time. Be on the alert for what, if I take a certain course of action, what events accompany it. I remember, for instance, some time back, I ventured put a certain project into the hands of somebody that required me to drive to his house and hand it over. And in the process of that trip, although I'm a fairly careful driver, I found myself driving the wrong way on a one-way street. Well, I knew then I was doing something wrong with what I had in mind. I took those auspices right on the spot, you see. That's just an illustration of the attitude of the auspices. I had already delivered the project, so it was too late, but I knew what was going to happen. The second phase that Jung speaks about is that of ancient Judaism, in which the ego-self relation is expressed in the form of a legal contract, a covenant. The basic texts to illustrate this particular mode are found in Genesis 17 and in Exodus 24. In Genesis 17, Yahweh announces to Abram that he is going to make a covenant with him, and that Abram, who up to that time had no children, was going to have a progeny as many as the stars. And the other text is Exodus 24, where Moses acts out the ritual of establishing a covenant between Yahweh and the Israelites. He sacrifices an animal, collects the blood, and divides it into two portions, and one portion is thrown onto Yahweh's altar, signifying the presence of Yahweh, and the other portion of the blood is thrown onto the Israelites, thus setting up a blood covenant. The idea being that the two parties have been united by the glue of blood that's been shed, and they are now committed to fulfilling the contract that they had agreed to. And the contract was that the Israelites would obey Yahweh's laws, and he'd take care of them in return. The third one is Christianity, that, as Jung speaks of it, emphasizes a love relation. We already know in ancient Judaism that marriage was one of the images that was used to describe the relation between the whole nation of Israel and Yahweh. Israel was considered to be the wife of Yahweh. But this was differentiated further in the Christian elaboration so that it applied more to individuals than just to the collective. And also it elaborated the love aspect of the relationship between ego and the self. I think one gets the most extreme version of that in the first letter of John. This is a letter that Jung refers to in the latter part of Answer to Job. But here's the extreme form of that. For the author of 1 John says in the 4th chapter, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone that loveth is born of God, and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. And this was manifested the love of God towards us, because that God sent his only begotten Son into the world that we might live through him. Herein is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. And if God so loved us, we ought to love one another. If we love one another, God dwelleth in us, and his love is perfected in us." See, it's all love. Now that links up with what has become the operative term for the Christian's ego-self relation. That operative term is faith. This is a confusing term because it developed in two different directions, really. It developed on the one hand to refer to belief, and on the other hand to refer to loyalty to a value that one loves. So you get the distinction when you consider the opposites of those two. The opposite of belief is doubt, and the opposite of loyalty is treason. But they're distinctly different notions, and the aspect of belief is the one that Jung expresses himself so forcefully about, because he says whenever whenever there is an excess of conscious belief, then doubt will be generated in the unconscious. Of course, the same can be said of loyalty. Whenever there is a total dependent, one-sided notion of loyalty for a given value, treason can be generated in the unconscious. But the point I want to mention here is that the idea of faith is associated with the ego-self relation as one of love. So you see, we can characterize these three stages, or these three aspects, with three different words. In antiquity, the word is omen. In ancient Judaism, the operative word is law. In Christianity, the word is faith. And going on to the fourth phase, the psychological phase, the operative word there is experience. Now, each of these has a psychological equivalent. See, the superstitious phase will refer to an openness to the unconscious on the part of a weak and undeveloped ego. So it's something you're most apt to find in childhood. The apotropaisms of childhood, for instance. Don't step on a crack, you'll break your mother's back. Or the lurking of witches, things like that. That would correspond to the superstitious phase on the unconscious level. The legal phase corresponds to a condition in which the ego relates to the transpersonal authority with great emphasis on rules and precepts, maybe even compulsive preoccupation with correct behavior, and even going to the extent of informing on those who violate the rules. But the law and rule is the operative term. For those for whom the ego-self relation is largely determined by love or faith, what will dominate will be a feeling attachment to an ideal, principle, or beloved model of some kind. And then there is the fourth phase, what I call the psychological phase, in which there's a living experience of the psyche and its transpersonal center, and in a certain sense, that involves a return to number one, and it corresponds to the fact that Jung preferred that one. He says that. Let's see where that is. No, I don't find it right now. I don't feel. Page 43, the last paragraph. Yeah, that is where it is. The original form of religio is without question aptly characterized by the implications of Edinger. I prefer this interpretation of religio because it's in better accord with the general psychological findings. And he had, as I quoted earlier, he had a very nice, fulsome description of the attitude involved. Religion means a watchful, wary, thoughtful, careful, prudent, expedient, and calculating attitude towards the powers that be. He used a lot of words there. He wanted to get it all in, because what he's talking about is the attitude we ought to have to the unconscious. Okay, the next item I want to talk about now is comes from a remark on page 484. It says, faith without religion would therefore be translated as non-denominational religion without creed, manifestly an unorganized, non-collective, entirely individual exercise of the religious function. And by the latter, I mean the allegiance, surrender, or submission to a superordinate factor or to a convincing, overpowering principle. That's what he means by the religious function, you see. Allegiance, surrender, or submission to the superordinate factor. You may remember from the Lang letter a couple of times ago, Jung said, I'm loyal to my inner experience and have pistis in the Pauline sense. That's the Greek word that's translated faith, but with the special nuance of loyalty, you see. Jung describes these matters with great clarity in his Terry lectures, which are found in volume 11. Let me read you a little bit of this. The paragraphs I'm interested in are paragraphs 8 to 10. I want to just read you a few phrases because they amplify what Jung says in the letter about the religious function. Religion appears to me to be a peculiar attitude of the human mind which could be formulated in accordance with the original use of the term religio. That is, a careful consideration, observation of certain dynamic factors understood to be powers, spirits, demons, gods, laws, ideas, ideals, or whatever name man has given to such factors. It is true that every confession, religious confession, is originally based upon the experience of the numinosum, and on the other hand, upon pistis, the loyalty, trust, and confidence toward a definitely experienced numinous effect. And then he makes here a very pregnant remark. Religion, it might be said, is the term that designates the attitude peculiar to a consciousness which has been altered by the experience of the numinosum. That comes from paragraph 9 of volume 11. Religion is the term that designates the attitude peculiar to a consciousness which has been altered by the experience of the numinosum. Now, going on to item 4, you will have noticed in this letter that just as in the previous letter, Martin Buber was a prominent background figure, so in this letter, Rudolf Bultmann appears. Apparently, Tanner had asked Jung about his reaction to Bultmann, and Jung had replied, on page 484, tenets of belief have to be purified or made easier by being relieved of their principal encumbrances, which for the rationalist are their particularly obnoxious mythological components. Bultmann's endeavors are obviously intended to serve this purpose. Where they should or could stop is highly questionable. Christ as Redeemer, for instance, is a mythologism of the first order, and so too is the Son of God, the Son of Man, etc. faith without religion or religion without creed is simply a logical consequence which has got out of Bultmann's control. Now, what Jung is referring to there is a major notion of Bultmann's. Namely, he thought that modern Christianity, in order to be palatable to the rationalism of moderns, must be demythologized. That was the idea. That was his word. He was a New Testament scholar and theologian, and that's what his later work was concerned with. The idea of demythologizing the New Testament. His idea was that the whole framework of the early Christian preaching, which the New Testament illustrates, presupposed an obsolete conception of the universe, and that all these mythological elements needed to be removed or reinterpreted so that the issue could become meaningful to modern man. I'll read you a few significant sentences from Bultmann. Cosmology of the New Testament is essentially mythical in character. The world is a three-storied structure. Earth in the center, heaven above, and the underworld below. It's the scene of the supernatural activity of God and his angels, and Satan and his demons. He goes into considerable more detail, but then he says, this proclamation is incredible to modern man. So he's convinced that the mythical view of the world is obsolete. So how can we preach the gospel today and make it credible is the idea, you see. And Bultmann's notion was that it has to be demythologized. This is very similar to the notion that Matthew Arnold came to. Matthew Arnold was a poet only in his romantic youth. When he got older, he became preoccupied with the whole question of how could religion be rescued from its demise. And he came to the idea that it could be approached as literature or poetry. But that demythologized it also. He gave us the very anemic definition that religion is morality tinged with emotion. These are the modern day notions that Jung is rejecting in this letter. Because he says religion requires a mythological object. I quote from the bottom of page 484 and going on to 485. If the believer without religion now thinks he has gotten rid of mythology, he is deceiving himself. He cannot get by without myth. Religio is by its very nature always towards something. No matter whether the following accusatives be God, Redeemer, a philosophical idea, or an ethical principle, it is always a mythic or transcendental statement. Jung can say that because he discovered the archetypes. But for a person who has not yet discovered the archetypes, of course, he won't be aware that the particular principle that he is deifying, in effect, has at its core an archetypal content. Now this leads directly to the next item I wanted to mention, and that's the remark that Jung makes that matter can be a numinous mythological object. If I just read a little further, the same paragraph that I was quoting, we'll come to that. Religio is by its very nature always a towards something, no matter whether the following accusative be God, Redeemer, a philosophical idea, or an ethical principle. It's always a mythic or transcendental statement. This is naturally also the case when the ultimate principle is called matter. Only the totally naive think this is the opposite of myth. Materia is, in the end, simply a chthonic mother goddess. And the late Pope seems to have an inkling of this. Compare the second encyclical to the Dogma of the Assumption. Matter can be a numinous mythological object. You see, this is precisely what happened beginning about 1500 AD. The numinosum fell out of heaven and fell into the psyche, from which it was immediately projected into matter, either externally, either in terms of extroverted activity or in terms of introverted activity. What took Columbus across the ocean? A projection of the numinosum over on the other side, you see. And what took the newly emerging scientists, what gave them their impetus, it was the projection of the numinosum into matter. It became fascinating. And alchemy prepared the way for that, you see, because for the alchemists, the numinosum had already been projected into matter. And that's what gave them their indefatigable energy to pursue this impossible quest for a lifetime. The image of the philosopher's stone that was shining through matter beckoned them on their religious quest. And the alchemists psychologically were therefore very much the precursors of modern science. Scientific research up until it became a government project was a religious quest, basically. I know the fact of this projection of the numinosum into matter. I know it to be a fact because I experienced it in my own boyhood with an intense fascination with chemistry. So I feel I really had a sense of what the alchemists were experiencing. Another item I want to mention comes from page 486, where Jung speaks of the surrogates to authentic religion. For many religious people today, even this concession to myth is dropped, and they content themselves with a bashfully veiled theism, which has a minimum of the traditional mythical encumbrances. Beyond that, there are only surrogates, like exotic theosophical ideas or other regressive isms, all of which culminate in materialism. where one succumbs to the illusion of having finally escaped each and every mythological bugbear. Now I want to draw your attention to this phrase, regressive isms. That was a term that Jung made a number of pronouncements about. Let me just read you a few of those pronouncements coming from one essay. I culled these quotes just from one essay, and that's the essay on the nature of the psyche, which is found in volume 8. These are various remarks about ism. Unconscious contents in the majority of cases are not repressed contents, but simply contents that are not yet conscious and have not been subjectively realized, like the demons and gods of the primitives or the isms so fanatically believed in by modern man. Most people feel afraid of the menacing power that lies fettered in each of us, only waiting for the magic word to release it from the spell. This magic word, which always ends in ism, works most successfully with those who have the least access to their interior selves and have strayed the furthest from their instinctual roots into the truly chaotic world of collective consciousness. The more highly charged the collective consciousness, the more the ego forfeits its practical importance. It is, as it were, absorbed by the opinions and tendencies of collective consciousness, and the result of that is the mass man, the ever-ready victim of some wretched ism. Once Mother Church and her motherly eros fall into abeyance, the individual is at the mercy of any passing collectivism and the attendant mass psyche. He succumbs to social or national inflation, and the tragedy is that he does so with the same psychic attitude which had once bound him to a church. But if he is independent enough to recognize the bigotedness of the social ism, he may then be threatened with subjective inflation, as opposed to social inflation. I draw your attention to that because we see this phenomenology everywhere today, and I do not even dare to give you specific examples of the isms that are flourishing, because if I were to do so, I would immediately evoke the demons that lie behind them, and I will not do that collectively. I have a couple of other items, but I'm going to save them for next time.
I heard a wonderful story at the Chiron conference this summer about the Minnesota falling into the sphere of the Earth at around 1500. Apparently in Columbus's diaries, he actually thought he might sailing near to the Garden of Eden, and he wasn't sure. Perhaps the Earth was pear-shaped, and he felt that the Garden of Eden would be at the tip of the pear. So he was hopeful that was like a secret hope of his in making the journey.
That's a beautiful example. That's what it really is. The other side of that was that some of the sailors thought they might fall off the edge of the earth into hell or chaos, which would be the negative version of the same thing.
In your first evening, you mentioned Marcion, is that right?
That's right.
Who felt that the God of the New Testament had nothing to do with the Old Testament and wanted to cut off the roots or split off from the roots, and that would have been a dangerous dissociation of the connection, and that at any time, a period of change from one age to another, that there's a danger of that, and everyone's concerned about that during our time. I was thinking about that because I've been meaning to ask you about that in terms of our modern time. where the Marcion phenomenon is for us moderns. So I wonder whether he's talking about it here.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Because if we mythologize everything, we lose the connection to the meaningfulness of our roots.
Absolutely. I went through this sequence in my own evolving development. I went through a period of time in my life when I considered religion and all of its manifestations as just the archaic, superstitious, and ignorant prelude to rational consciousness. And on that ground, I couldn't understand why people would spend their time, first of all, doing scholarly studies of these ancient mythologies, and the same thing applied to ancient philosophy. So far as I could see, the ancient philosophers were just groping around in the dark and making largely ignorant efforts to picture their surrounding reality, when more modern developments revealed such groping just to be ignorant mistakes. You see, it was an example of the redemptive power of Jungian psychology. For me, not only did he redeem alchemy, but he redeemed ancient philosophy. He redeemed mythology. He redeemed all of the more primitive aspects of existence by virtue of demonstrating that they are manifestations of the psyche, and not just the past psyche, but the permanent, eternal, ever-living psyche that we can get in touch with right now. So that for me, Jung's work has been a vast redemptive process. Now, if I had been of a different temperament, I could have gotten that redemption in a different way. I could have discovered the poetry, let's say, some of the charm of those early ignorant mistakes. That might redeem them somewhat. But for a thinker, the redemption has to take place on its own level. You see, and Jung supplied that. And of course, the Marcion phenomenon was the one I was caught in earlier. That the previous gods are to be totally superseded, you see, and discarded. And one can't live a whole life that way because it splits you right down the middle. Mm-hmm.
It seems that your example is also pointing out the centrality of doubt toward consciousness. And I was struck by when you were talking tonight about belief, the opposite of belief is doubt, and putting that together with the second session where we talked about Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think, or I am conscious, therefore I am. What preceded that formulation for Descartes as he sat with epistemological problems was dubito ergo sum. I doubt, therefore I am. And then the formulation later on became I am.
Mm-hmm.
So doubt would seem to be an instrumental step toward consciousness.
Well, another way of putting it is that the experience of the opposite is a prerequisite to consciousness. Because he started with a state of belief, and then its opposite appeared, and then he was stuck with the opposite. Yeah.
I'm not sure, but I understand that Jung had, before he died, very frightening apocalyptic visions. And as I was reading the last part of his letter, which he was sort of warning against the rise of the Christian myth and civilization, and now it's been like 30, 40 years past. In some ways, symbolically, maybe those visions were sort of pointing towards what would happen to us as civilization, the demise of that myth. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
I don't have any inside information on the nature of Jung's apocalyptic visions. I don't know any more than what Mary Louise von Franz and Barbara Hanna have stated. I know no more than that. But I do have a very definite impression about the collective state of things in this letter. Let's see where it is. Page 486. Myth is preeminently a social phenomenon. It is told by the many and heard by the many. It gives the ultimately unimaginable religious experience an image, a form in which to express itself and thus make community life possible. That's the phrase I wanted to get to. A generally accepted myth makes community life possible. The implications of that psychological fact, I think, are immense. I believe that the evidence is very clear that every organic community, and that includes the largest communities of all, namely whole civilizations, exist as an organic entity because they are contained within a common myth, which provides all the members of that community a common basis of connection to the transpersonal. Now, what we're witnessing today is a profound breakdown of our collective myth. And the result is that there's a fragmentation of the body social. And it's breaking up into fragments of wretched isms, which Jung is talking about, you see. that are at war against each other. And the same thing that we see happening in Yugoslavia and other places which are released from the imposition of unity from above. If there is no containing myth to unify them from within or from below, then they disintegrate into wretched regressive ism, and that's the vast panorama that we witness everywhere today. Mm-hmm.
In that paragraph on 488 where he's talking about if the Christian myth is not to become obsolete, which would be a sellout with quite unpredictable consequences, the need for a more psychologically oriented interpretation that would salvage its meaning and guarantee its continuance forces itself upon us. Was he still hoping that somehow the Christian myth could be the central myth?
In one of these letters, I guess it isn't this one, it must be another one, he speaks about creating a new attitude, a new religious attitude to the future, and says, but for something to survive, if you build it, it has to have a foundation. And he thinks of the Christian myth as the foundation, because that's what connects us to the past. So his idea is that it's to undergo a transformation and have something, the psychological standpoint, built on top of it, so to speak.
What does he mean when he says he thought it would be a sellout? If the on 488, that same thing.
I know, I'm looking to see some of these letters are in English, but this one was in German, so it was translated. It makes a difference, you know, because it means it's the translator's word. And what do we mean when we use the word sellout? We mean, if I'm accused of a sellout, it means that I have a clear responsibility and duty to perform, but for personal reasons of self-aggrandizement, I turn my back on that duty and sell out for some lesser motive. That's what we mean by the word sellout. So presumably that's what's meant here. That if the Christian myth is not to become obsolete, which would be a sellout, if we have the duty to understand what its meaning is, and the fact that it has carried a whole civilization for a couple of thousand years, if we turn our back on that obligation to understand it, then that would be a sellout. Mm-hmm.
Reminds me of what Jung does in Memory of Dreams, in the later chapter titled Late Thoughts. And he talks about the metamorphosis of the body in terms of destruction. And I don't remember exactly what he says. He says it's like Christianity that failed. We have failed Christianity in terms of, these are my own words, but sort of in not building new words to the potential, the dogma, the assumption, but continuing to grow it on, dream it on, live it on. That there's something quite substantial and solid there. We haven't, and this reminds me of that. It's there waiting to be metamorphosed, to be new and to grow. That is the path.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that the movement from stage 3 into stage 4, which we're talking about, is one of the central experiences, or living experiences, like including an experience of the opposite. But that movement from 3 to 4 is not certainly something education and analysis can do. Not something that human beings can do, and even human beings who can get into phase 4 under certain stress, regrets all the way back, and certainly into wanting a rule and things again, that people don't stay there either all the time. Is that because it's so new? Is that because it's inherent? Some people just can't individuate that far. How do you understand awareness of people's ability to move into that stage and hold it?
Would you say it's certainly true? The way I see it is that Jung exemplifies a whole quantum leap in human consciousness. And he's occupying that new place all by himself. And he knew that. And he expressed that fact in one of his lugubrious letters. He bemoaned the fact that he's all alone. Few people understand this or that, but almost nobody understands the whole. That's the fate of the person who's ahead of his time, and whose life, therefore, is largely a posthumous life. He recognized that about himself. He used that term concerning himself. That his life was a posthumous one. And the question, of course, that is relevant for all of us to ask is what does this all have to do with everyday psychotherapy? I think it has a lot, and I'll tell you how. I'll try to tell you how. It's certainly true that the vast majority of our analyses will not find this specific material relevant to their immediate analytic process. However, it's my conviction that the nature and the extent of the analytic process is determined very largely by the depth of consciousness of the individual analyst. And if the individual analyst has some groping notion of what we're dealing with here, and that's all we can expect, that's all I've got, very groping notion. But if these issues, the issues of the new eon, have been touched, have touched the psyche of the analyst, that's going to affect the analytic process between that analyst and her patients. Inductively, you see. And it's not something that will be pushed on the individual if it's not appropriate to them, providing the analyst is conscious enough about it. He won't impose religious and transpersonal considerations if the material doesn't dictate it. But for certain individuals, the awareness of that transpersonal and transhistorical dimension allows for an unfolding of the analytic process in a way that wouldn't otherwise be possible. That's my view of the matter, anyway.
On page 483, Jung talks about the distance between God and man so great that Yahweh frees himself to rise to such an embassy. And I was struck that it seems to be that the relationship between God and man is closer during the period of Judaism, or in that stage psychologically, than it is between a superficial stage. And it's interesting that it's at that stage that the need for the advocate is suggested, say, in the book of Job. That an intermediary, the need for that, becomes more of a need the closer that God comes to man. Because not only is the advocate suggested and then lived out by the birth of Christ, because it's suggested when Job says, I know my Redeemer liveth, which is I think he's living for the advocate, which will stand up for him in the face of God's dark side. And then Christ has to come. And then it turns into, in Christianity, the paraclete, which then comes from the opposite direction, as if the advocate is somebody that needs to represent man in the court of God, whereas the paraclete comes from the transpersonal to continue the teachings of Christ once Christ is gone. Which they seem to turn into almost equivalence, because advocate and paraclete mean the same thing. They're direct translations, and yet they come from different realms. I'm struck by, it seems to be the closer that man gets to God, now thinking psychologically now between the ego and the unconscious, the more the necessity for the mediator, the intermediate figure, which
you see, you may remember from the first introductory session, antiquity was the phase of polytheism, and ancient Judaism was the beginning of monotheism. And monotheism was associated with the establishment of a specific relationship between God and man. And there was no such personal relationship in polytheism, which makes all of antiquity essentially tragic. There is no redemption to be had in antiquity. Because although there were various devices like the augurs and the omens to read certain messages from the divine realm, there was no living connection of concern, you see, and that means that antiquity hovered between heroism and despair. The heroic was accomplished in spite of the tragic, feudal state of humanity. You see, the central wisdom of antiquity was enunciated by Sophocles, that best for man to never been born at all, and next best to die young. that was the pinnacle of ancient wisdom. And that's the consequence of that stage of relation between the ego and the self, you see. And that all changes with the emergence of monotheism and the personal relationship connection between the ego and the self. Time's up. See you next week.